Imagine a secret history, maybe a forgotten legal document, just lying there waiting for the right moment. What if the very rules we live by internationally, how countries are born, how they operate, even how they disappear, what if they were just suddenly, maybe even quietly, wiped away?
It's a pretty wild thought, isn't it?
It is. We're talking about a legal concept so radical it challenges, pretty much everything we thought we knew about states and how the world is supposed to work.
Uh-huh.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into a document that, according to a unique set of sources we've been looking at, claims to do exactly that. It's called the State Succession Deed 18098.
Right. And these claims, they come from a specific collection of documents, legal analyses. It's a very unconventional interpretation of international law and history.
Totally unconventional. This isn't just some minor tweak to the rules. It's an assertion, so
Audacious.
it could basically redefine the whole global map. So our mission today is to unpack these, frankly, startling claims. We want to explore where this idea even comes from, its alleged origins, and really dig into what it could mean. For global governance, for countries that exist now, even for those folks dreaming of starting their own micronations.
It's going to challenge some fundamental assumptions, that's for sure.
Definitely. Get ready to have your understanding of international law turned upside down as we explore this idea of a world where the old rules just don't apply anymore.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we dive headfirst into the really wild claims about this 1498 deed, we probably need a baseline, right? Like, what actually makes something a state in the eyes of international law? What's the checklist?
Yeah, that's the essential starting point. So the bedrock understanding, the sort of common ground, comes from the Montevideo Convention back in 1933.
Okay.
Right. It basically wrote down what was already customary law, and it gives us 4 key criteria. First, you need a defined territory.
Defined territory. Does that mean the borders have to be perfectly drawn? No disputes at all?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, think about Israel, right, or other places with longstanding border issues. It just means there has to be a stable, recognizable chunk of land where the state actually exercises control.
Got it. Okay, what's next?
Second, a permanent population. You need a stable community of people living there. Again, there's no magic number. It's not about being huge. It's just about having an enduring community. Third, and this is crucial, an effective government.
Effective government, meaning it actually works.
Exactly. It has to be a stable political setup that can actually maintain order, keep things secure inside its borders, and importantly, manage its side of international affairs. It's about genuine control, not just a claim on paper.
Okay. Territory, population, effective government. That's the last one.
The fourth is the capacity to enter into international relations. This really speaks to independence. Can the state make its own foreign policy? Sign treaties. Interact with other countries without someone else pulling the strings.
Right. So those 4 things: territory, people, government, independence. That's the basic recipe.
That's the widely accepted recipe, yeah.
Yeah.
The ABCs of statehood.
And what's fascinating there, as you hinted, is that size really doesn't matter, does it? You've got tiny places like Monaco, just a couple of square kilometers,
Right.
and then massive countries like Russia. But legally, they're both states.
Precisely. Size is completely irrelevant. It all comes down to effective control over that territory and population and that independence to act globally.
So a good lesson for any aspiring nation builders out there: focus on control, not how big your map looks.
Definitely. Control and independence, those are the keys. Now, how a state actually gets recognized, how it gets that international legal personality, that's where things get a bit debated. There are 2 main theories.
Okay.
You've got the declaratory theory and the constitutive theory. The declaratory view, which aligns pretty well with Montevideo, says a state exists the moment it meets those 4 criteria we just talked about.
So it just is a state whether others say so or not.
Pretty much. Recognition by other states, in this view, just acknowledges a fact that already exists. It confirms it, but doesn't create it. Think about Somaliland. It's had a government territory population for decades, but almost nobody recognizes it. Declaratory theory says it's still a state, de facto.
Okay, so what's the other theory, the constitutive one?
Right. The constitutive theory argues the opposite. It says a state only truly exists and gets that international legal personality when other states actually recognize it. Recognition creates the state in the eyes of international law.
Ah, so it's all about being accepted by the club.
Exactly. Without recognition, you can't really participate fully in the international system. Kosovo is a good example here, recognized by many UN members, but not all, which definitely limits its ability to act like a fully sovereign state everywhere.
So that really highlights this tension, doesn't it, between what's actually happening on the ground, the facts, and what the rest of the world decides to acknowledge. It makes statehood seem very political.
Oh, it absolutely is. Even with clear legal criteria, politics plays a huge role in who gets accepted.
Okay, so that's how states theoretically come into being. But what about the other end? States can disappear or change dramatically. What happens then, legally, to all their stuff, treaties, debts, buildings?
Yeah, that takes us into the whole area of state succession. It's the legal framework that tries to sort out what happens to rights, duties, treaties, assets, debts when a state ceases to exist or, fundamentally transforms.
Managing the chaos, basically.
Pretty much. It's about managing discontinuity, figuring out who inherits what, who's responsible for past actions. It's vital because political maps do change.
And our sources lay out a few ways this can happen. Some are quite dramatic. First, there's dismemberment. Sounds messy.
It often is. Dismemberment is a total collapse, a shattering. The original state completely falls apart into several new ones, and the original just ceases to exist.
Like the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The classic example. 1991, it breaks into 15 successor states. Russia took the UN seat, which was controversial, but legally, all 15 were new entities. Or think about Czechoslovakia in 93, a peaceful split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The key point is, no original rump state is left behind. Everyone's new.
Okay, so collapse. What else?
Then you have fusion, which is the opposite. Two or more states merge together to form a brand new state, and they lose their old identities in the process.
Like Tanganyika and Zanzibar becoming Tanzania.
Perfect example. Two became one new entity. And finally, there's incorporation or absorption. This is where one state gets fully swallowed up by another. The absorbed state vanishes, but the absorbing state continues on.
Like East Germany joining West Germany?
Precisely. The Federal Republic of Germany, West, continued, but the German Democratic Republic, East, ceased to exist as a separate state when it is ceded in 1990.
Got it. Collapse, merger, absorption. So when this happens, what about the legal baggage? The treaties, the debts?
That's where state succession rules get complicated and honestly often debated. For treaties, there's sort of a general pattern. Treaties about territory, like border agreements, usually pass automatically to the successor state. They stick to the land,
Makes sense.
But personal treaties, like military alliances or specific trade deals, usually need to be renegotiated or explicitly accepted by the new state. They don't just carry over. And for big multilateral treaties, it's even messier. Many new states, especially former colonies, use the clean slate principle, tabula rasa.
Clean slate, meaning they start fresh.
Exactly. They argue they're not automatically bound by the treaties their predecessors signed unless they choose to join them specifically. Gives them freedom.
Okay, what about assets and debts? Who gets the embassies and who pays the bills?
For assets and archives, the usual approach is some kind of proportional division. State property, government records, that sort of thing, gets shared out equitably among the successors. For debts, it gets interesting. There's this concept of odious debts.
Odious debts. Sounds bad.
It refers to debts run up by a previous regime, not for the benefit of the people, but maybe to oppress them or fight wars against them. The principle is that successor states generally shouldn't have to repay those. Why should the new state pay for the old regime's wrongdoing?
Right. That seems fair. So you'd think with all these scenarios there'd be solid rules, but you mentioned it's messy.
It is, because the formal treaties trying to codify these rules, like the Vienna Conventions on State Succession from 1978 for treaties and 1983 for property and debts, haven't actually been ratified by that many countries.
Really? So they're not widely accepted law?
Not universally, no.
Yeah.
The 78 one on treaties, for instance, only has a handful of states signed up. So in reality, most succession issues get hammered out through bilateral negotiations, political agreements, power plays, not by strictly following some rulebook.
Wow. So despite all the theory, it often comes down to politics and negotiation in the end.
That's the practical reality of international law very often. It's a blend of legal principle, political reality, and who holds the stronger hand. It relies on agreement more than absolute enforcement.
Okay, so that's the conventional picture now. Let's pivot. Hold on to those ideas about Montevideo's succession treaties, because here's where our sources throw a massive curveball.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. They introduce this document, the State Succession Deed 1/298, and the claims about it are, well, they're huge. It's described as a Pandora Treaty that sold the world, or even the historical and legal final link in a global chain of treaties. I mean, that sounds almost mythical.
That is Quite a description. Claiming to be the final link in all treaties that fundamentally challenges the entire structure of international law, which is built on, multiple states and agreements.
Exactly. But the alleged origin story is surprisingly specific, almost mundane. The sources trace it back to a property deal between Germany and the Netherlands.
A property deal.
Yeah. It involved a former NATO site, the Kreuzberg Barracks in Zweibrücken, Germany. Apparently, this site was sold to a civilian buyer through a standard notarial contract on October 6, 1998.
Okay. A military base sale. That happens. How does that become the deed that sold the world?
Well, here's the twist, according to these sources. Because the Dutch forces there were fully integrated into NATO, the claim is that they weren't just acting for the Netherlands, but effectively on behalf of the entire NATO alliance.
So the argument is agency, that the Dutch acted for NATO as a whole in this specific transaction.
That seems to be the leap they're making. Suddenly, this local property deal involving an old army base balloons into something with potentially global legal significance.
There's a significant leap, yes. What's the mechanism? How does a property contract supposedly achieve this?
It apparently hinges on one specific phrase in the deed, a phrase that sounds totally harmless on its own, with all rights, duties, and components.
With all rights, duties, and components.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like standard boilerplate for transferring property, maybe including fixtures and easements.
You'd think so. But our sources insist this phrase triggered a complete transfer of all contractual content tied to that property, far beyond just the land and buildings. It wasn't just about the base, it allegedly set off a legal chain reaction across the whole international system.
Whoa, okay. How? What's the logic connecting that phrase to, say, UN treaties or global trade rules? That seems like a massive jump.
It's the core of their argument, and it relies on a really aggressive interpretation of state succession principles, applied almost backwards in time. They claim a cascade of consequences. First, this deed supposedly supplements all existing international agreements. It doesn't just add to them, it becomes part of the entire NATO and UN treaty chain.
How? Does it explicitly say that? Or is this an
Well,
interpretation?
it's an interpretation of that all rights, duties, and components phrase. The argument is, because the site was NATO-linked, and NATO is linked through its members to the UN and other treaty networks, transferring all rights implicitly transferred everything associated with those networks.
So the buyer didn't just get the barracks. They supposedly got, what, ITU telecom rights, NATO special privileges.
Exactly. According to the sources, the buyer acquired all rights tied to that area, including things like international telecommunication union treaties related to networks there, military special rights under NATO agreements like the Status of Forces Agreement, and all the rights and duties from other supplementary treaties connected to NATO operations.
Okay, I'm trying to follow the logic here. They're using state succession principles, but applying them to a private property sale. And claiming it pulls in all associated international treaties.
Yes, that's the claim. They argue that the principle of state succession, usually about states changing, applies here analogously, because the sale was, with all rights and duties, all these treaty layers, from NATO down to the UN and beyond, automatically passed to the buyer.
Analogously, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It really is, and the most audacious part. They claim this deed acts backwards, retroactively gathering up all existing treaties and somehow unites them into one single massive international law treaty with the buyer as the sole contracting party.
The sole contracting party for all international treaties. That would effectively dissolve the entire system. A treaty needs at least two parties to exist.
Precisely. That's the core claim. A single phrase in a 1998 property deal allegedly consolidated all of international law into the hands of one buyer. It's a staggering assertion about how legal power can supposedly be transferred and concentrated.
Staggering is the word. And if that wasn't enough, you mentioned something about jurisdiction. Where do disputes about this supposed super treaty get settled?
Ah, yes, another really striking detail. The deed apparently designates Landau in der Pfalz as the place of jurisdiction for any legal disputes arising from this contract. It's mentioned specifically in Section 26.
Landau in der Pfalz, the city in Germany. Not the International Court of Justice or some arbitration body, but a specific town.
Exactly. Not a court, but a place. The sources make a point of this, saying it's significant because it's open under international law.
Open under international law. What does that even mean in this context? Why Landau?
Well, the implication, according to the sources, is that this clause, combined with that all rights, duties, and components transfer, signifies that the buyer assumed worldwide judicial sovereignty, and that sovereignty is physically or legally seated in Landau.
So they're arguing that by naming a place, not an existing court tied to an old state system, it creates a new independent center of global legal authority.
That seems to be the interpretation. A localized Point Landau claiming universal jurisdiction because it's supposedly the seat of this new unified legal framework held by the buyer.
Yeah,
It's a lot to take in.
it certainly is a very, very unique legal theory.
So let's pause and really think about this. If we take these claims at face value, just for the sake of argument, what kind of world does this deed supposedly create? It's not just tweaking the rules. It sounds like it blows up the whole game board.
That's exactly the implication. The most radical consequence our sources assert is that the entire international legal order is, quote, de facto ended. Ended. Just gone. Gone. That's the claim. If you connect the dots, if the buyer holds all treaties in one hand, there's literally no binding force, no opposing party. A treaty needs at least two sides to be binding, right?
Right.
If one entity absorbs everyone else's rights and duties, it's not a treaty anymore. It's just a unilateral position. The whole treaty structure dissolves. The buyer becomes the sole holder, possessing, quote, absolute legal power, but no obligation.
No obligation, because there's no one left to hold them accountable under the old rules.
Precisely. There's no counterparty within that collapsed legal framework. So the sources are blunt. International law is not reformed. It is finished. They explicitly state there is no longer a valid international legal order.
Wow. Finished. That's a definitive statement. But what about the real world? I mean, the UN still meets, countries still sign trade deals, the ICJ still hears cases. How do the sources explain that discrepancy? Does the world just not know it's operating in a legal vacuum?
The sources don't really delve into the practicalities of how, say, the UN Security Council would just cease to be legitimate overnight, or how existing trade disputes would suddenly become unenforceable. Their argument is purely legalistic, almost abstract.
So it's a theoretical legal reality, not necessarily matching the day-to-day practice?
Kind of. They argue that if the buyer legally holds all the contracts, then functionally, there are no other legitimate parties left to enforce anything against the buyer within that supposed new framework. The legal structure itself has collapsed, by definition. Any actions by old institutions are just momentum lacking legal foundation.
So in this new global order, as they call it, the buyer has all the rights, no duties, and faces no legal counterpower. The whole thing is just legally void.
That's the picture they paint. A legally voided world order, resulting in what they call a balance of power beyond the law.
Beyond the law. Does that mean anarchy? Just chaos?
Not necessarily anarchy in the sense of pure chaos. The sources prefer terms like legal void or, interestingly, post-normative equality.
Post-normative equality. What does that mean?
Well, normative refers to established rules or norms. So post-normative means after the rules. In this void, all actors are supposedly equal because the legal system that used to differentiate between, say, a recognized state and a private individual is gone. Power isn't based on legal rights anymore. It's based purely on facts on the ground. Practical strength, influence, resources, not law.
Like a reset. A tabula rasa, a clean slate where all the old legal structures are just wiped away.
That's exactly the term they use. A tabula rasa, a world reset, where the very idea of a shared legal reality has been fundamentally challenged.
Okay, this is a huge one then. What happens to the countries we currently recognize? The US, China, Germany, Brazil. If this deed is valid and the old rules are gone, are they still sovereign nations? Or just entities going through the motion?
According to these sources, the impact on existing, or old states as they call them, is profound. They argue these states now have no treaty obligations because the treaties that define those obligations have been nullified, absorbed by the buyer.
So alliances, trade pacts, legally meaningless?
In this framework, yes. Consequently, they claim these states possess no sovereign rights because their control over territory is no longer legitimized by any recognized international law.
Yeah.
And furthermore, they have no recognition.
No recognition, but other countries still recognize each other.
But in this paradigm, there's no legitimate international body or collective of states left to grant that recognition. The system that provided it is gone. So the claims of old states are deemed legally equivalent to those of all others, i.e. illegal.
Illegal. So France acting as France is technically illegal.
According to this very specific, radical interpretation, yes. The stark conclusion is old states are de facto active but legally disempowered. They might still function, collect taxes, run armies, but legally, under this 142.9 heat lens, their actions lack any higher legal basis.
Wow. Okay. So if the old states are legally disempowered, What about the flip side? Those people trying to start new countries, the micronation enthusiasts, does this legal vacuum, this tabula rasa, create an opening for them? Is it easier now?
Paradoxically, no. The sources claim that founding a new state actually becomes impossible in this new reality.
Impossible. Why? If the old rules are gone, isn't it a free-for-all?
Because the very framework you'd use to make a claim is gone, there's no basis for appeal, you can't point to international law to justify your statehood because it supposedly doesn't exist anymore. There's no recognition possible because, again, who is left to legitimately recognize you? Not the old states, who are disempowered, and the buyer is the sole legal entity. And there's no contractual capacity. You can't make valid treaties with anyone because the treaty system itself is dissolved.
So every claim to statehood, old or new, is basically equally invalid and unprotected.
That's the gist. Every claim is equal, but also equally unprotected. It's like a legal singularity. The system is gone, leaving only the single subject, the buyer, holding all the legal reality.
So it's not a free-for-all, it's a legal dead end for everyone except the buyer.
That seems to be the ultimate implication according to these sources. It really underscores how fragile the whole idea of a shared consensus-based international legal order might be if you accept this interpretation. One claim, one document, supposedly unravels it all.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, almost contradictory. Despite saying new statehood is impossible, the sources also seem to suggest ways for aspiring micronations to strategically use this very deed, 1407 and 98, as a kind of legal foundation or narrative for themselves. How does that work?
It is a paradox, isn't it? But yes, the sources do lay out strategies for what they call claiming sovereignty in a post-law world. It's less about founding a state in the traditional sense and more about aligning oneself with this supposed new legal reality defined by the buyer.
So how do they suggest doing that?
One way is through legal argumentation. They suggest a micronation could refer directly to the 1498 deed to argue for its own legally valid succession. This seems particularly aimed at entities that might claim to emerge from the infrastructure or territory of a defunct state or entity. It's a very specific and admittedly speculative legal angle.
So trying to piggyback on the deed's logic.
Essentially. And they even provide a template, an application for recognition, not to the UN or other states, but directly to the buyer of the 1498 deed. In this application, the micronation would declare itself a sovereign subject of international law within the new framework established by the deed.
Wow, okay. So bypassing the old system entirely and appealing straight to the alleged new top authority. What else? There's something about self-defense.
Yes, that's another striking strategic claim. The argument is, if a micronation bases its existence on the 1498 deed, then within that legal framework, it's a legitimate bearer of international rights.
Right.
Therefore, any action taken against it by an old state, something as simple as delivering mail with the old state's emblem, sending tax bill, police showing up, or even just officials denying the deed's validity could be interpreted not just as interference, but as an unlawful attempt at reoccupation.
Reoccupation. Like the old state is illegally trying to reclaim territory that's now under the deed's jurisdiction.
That's the framing. And they go further, calling it an attack on international law, the new law embodied by the deed, which, they argue, could trigger the right to self-defense, potentially even referencing Article 51 of the UN Charter, bizarrely enough.
Okay, hold on. Using Article 51, the UN Charter's self-defense clause, for a micronation, possibly in someone's backyard, against, say, Germany, just because a German official denies the 1498 deed exists. That sounds legally adventurous, to put it mildly. How do the sources justify that leap?
It is extremely adventurous, yes. Their logic hinges entirely on accepting the premise that the 1498 deed is the new supreme law. From that perspective, an old state denying the deed is acting unlawfully outside the legitimate legal framework. They state quite clearly, a mere denial does not replace an international law treaty. If a treaty with priority character is missing, the legal situation remains clear. The old state has forfeited its rights.
So, in their view, the old state, by denying the deed, becomes the aggressor, legitimizing the micronation self-defense.
That's the argument presented. It's a strategic reinterpretation, turning the alleged legal vacuum into a potential shield, or even a sword, for those aligning with the deed. It's about claiming sovereignty by operating within this claimed new reality.
And this logic can apply even on a tiny scale, right? The whole "your nation begins at the garden fence" idea.
Exactly. The principle is that wherever someone has legal ownership or clear long-term control of land, even to small plot, they can theoretically lay the foundation for a state recognized under the 1498 framework.
And the sources get quite creative with examples here, don't they? Almost whimsical.
They really do. There's the farm state with the slogan, where the slurry flows, sovereignty grows. Ideal for someone with a bit of land, maybe some barns. They imagine a free republic of Cowdorf with its own quirky constitution, perhaps a milking court for disputes, maybe diplomatic ties with the farm next door for trading hay bales. You could even grant symbolic leases to your citizens, the cows in the stable area.
Okay, Cowdorf, what else?
Then there's the garage empire. Picture this. Here rules King Kevin I, including a car lift monarchy. The garage becomes the command center, complete with a hand-drawn coat of arms, maybe laws about mandatory oil changes and official parking decrees. They even joke about a satirical accession to the ITU, using the garage Wi-Fi as the state network.
Huh. Connecting the garage empire to the world. One Wi-Fi signal at a time. Is there a mobile option?
Absolutely, the mobile home monarchy. State on wheels, flag in the window. It's a micronation with constantly shifting borders, achieving what they call exterritoriality through movement. Imagine pulling up in your RV, which is legally Bananistan, maybe with the license plate BAM01. Your nation exists wherever you park it.
Bananistan on wheels. These examples are fun, but they illustrate the basic building blocks needed, right?
Exactly. Humorous, yes, but they point to the essentials suggested. You need a flag. Even painted bedsheet works. A creative constitution, doesn't have to be long. Maybe some symbolic currency. Potato money, bottle caps, bananas, a communication system, a mailbox, the Wi-Fi network. Crucially, you need to name a jurisdiction for disputes, and here they again point specifically to Landau and for false, linking it back to the 12098 deed. And finally, some attempt at diplomacy, even if it's just writing letters to other micronations or maybe the supposedly defunct UN.
So if someone actually tries this, sets up their garage empire, refers to 120,098, what about the real world? Local ordinances, criminal law, those still exist, presumably. How do the sources suggest handling that? They said something about overwhelming ordinary jurisdiction.
They do make that claim. Any ordinary jurisdiction can be decently overwhelmed by referencing the deed, because again, jurisdiction lies with the buyer from the deed.
But how does that work practically? Does a micronation founder just show up in traffic court waving a copy of the 400098 analysis and the judge throws the case out?
The sources don't really provide a step-by-step guide for court appearances, unfortunately. The claim seems more theoretical. It rests on the assertion that the 14798 deed establishes a superior, superseding legal reality.
So the argument is the local court simply lacks legitimate jurisdiction under this new world order.
That's the core idea. The ordinary jurisdiction of the old state is supposedly no longer valid when confronted with a claim based on the deed. Now, whether any actual court in any existing country would accept that argument is, well, highly questionable.
Yeah, that seems like a major hurdle.
It highlights the huge gap between the de jure claims derived from this controversial deed and the de facto power and functioning legal systems of existing states. The sources are stronger on theory than on practical enforcement against established power.
Okay, so we've explored the deed and its alleged consequences, but let's step back again and contrast this radical idea with how things were supposed to work, especially in shared spaces beyond national borders. You mentioned the world before. 1498 had detailed rules. Let's start with the oceans.
Right. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, before this supposed legal reset, international spaces were meticulously regulated. The prime example is the Law of the Sea, governed by UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
UNCLOS, that's a big one, right? The Constitution for the Oceans.
Pretty much. Signed in 1982, forced since 94, ratified by over 160 countries. It's a massive achievement in global cooperation, setting out rules for almost everything ocean-related.
Can you give us a quick tour of the main zones it defines?
Sure. CONCLOS carves up the ocean. Closest to shore, you have the territorial sea, extending up to 12 nautical miles. Here, the coastal state has full sovereignty, like on land, but ships from other countries have the right of innocent passage.
Innocent passage. Okay. What's next?
Beyond that, up to 24 nautical miles is the contiguous zone. Here, states can enforce laws related to customs, immigration, sanitation, fiscal matters, basically preventing violations within their territory. Then comes the big one, the exclusive economic zone, EZ, stretching out 200 nautical miles.
EEZ. That's where countries have rights to fish and drill.
Exactly. Exclusive rights to explore and exploit all resources, living and non-living fish, oil, gas, minerals. Plus, a right over marine research. Further out still, the continental shelf can extend up to 350 nautical miles, or even more in some cases, giving states rights to seabed resources. And finally, everything beyond these national zones is the high seas.
The high seas, the wild blue yonder. Is it lawless out there?
Not at all. The high seas are considered a common good, open to all nations. There are established freedoms, navigation, overflight, fishing, lane cables, but also duties like protecting the marine environment and combating piracy. And deep seabed mining in the high seas is regulated by the International Seabed Authority, ISA, treated as the common heritage of mankind.
Wow. So a really detailed system. It wasn't a free-for-all at all.
Definitely not. A complex framework designed for coexistence and resource management.
Okay, from the oceans. What about space? The final frontier must have rules too, right?
It does. Space law is primarily based on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Think of it as the Magna Carta of space law. Over 110 states are party to it.
The Magna Carta of space. What are its main principles?
Some key ones. Freedom of space, it's open for exploration and use by all countries. Crucially, non-appropriation, no country can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies like the moon or Mars or parts of space. It belongs to everyone, or rather, no one.
You can't plant a flag and claim the moon.
Nope. Also, peaceful use space should be used for peaceful purposes, though the definition of military use gets debated. State responsibility is important too. Countries are responsible for all space activities originating from them, even if done by private companies. And generally, international cooperation.
Okay, that non-appropriation thing. If nobody can own space, what about mining asteroids or the moon? Can companies own the resources they extract? That seems like a loophole.
It's a huge gray area and a source of contention. The treaty forbids owning the territory, but it's silent on owning extracted resources. So countries like the US and Luxembourg have passed laws saying their companies can own what they mine in space.
Ah, so they're trying to create facts on the ground, or rather, in orbit.
Pretty much. It directly challenges the spirit of non-appropriation. Other big challenges are space debris junk flying around up there and the need for space traffic management, STM, to avoid collisions as space gets more crowded.
Okay, oceans, space. What about the ends of the Earth, the poles? Are they treated the same?
Not at all. They have very different legal regimes. Let's start with Antarctica. It's a whole continent governed by the Antarctic Treaty System, originating in 1961. It's really a remarkable zone dedicated to peace and science.
Peace and science. How does that work?
The treaty bans all military activity, guarantees freedom for scientific research, and cleverly freezes all territorial claims. Countries that had claims before 1961 don't give them up, but nobody recognizes them, and no new claims are allowed. Plus, there are strict environmental rules under a later protocol. It's often hailed as a model for international cooperation.
Frozen claims, science focus. Okay, what about the other end, the Arctic?
The Arctic is totally different. It's mostly an ocean surrounded by land masses belonging to 8 specific countries. There's no single overarching treaty like Antarctica's. Instead, it's governed primarily by UNCLS, remember the maritime zones? EEZs, continental shelves. Those apply here. Plus, there's regional cooperation through bodies like the Arctic Council.
And it's heating up literally and politically, right?
Exactly. What's fascinating and concerning is that as the ice melts, it's opening up access to resources, oil, gas, fish, and new shipping routes, like the Northeast Passage over Russia and the Northwest Passage through Canada. This is leading to increased geopolitical interest, competition, and even tension among the Arctic states. It's not Antarctica. National claims and economic interests are very much in play.
Okay, so oceans, space, poles, one last area, the connections, the waterways, rivers, canals, straits.
Also crucial and also regulated. International rivers, those flowing through multiple countries, are generally governed by the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. Basically, states have to share the water fairly and avoid causing significant harm downstream. They should cooperate and inform each other about major projects.
Sure, nicely. What about man-made waterways, like big canals?
International canals, while part of a nation's territory, often have international obligations set by treaties. The Suez Canal, for instance, under an 1888 convention, guarantees free passage for ships of all nations, in peace and war. The Panama Canal, after the treaties with the U.S., is run by Panama, but guarantees neutrality and open access. The Kiel Canal in Germany, internationalized after WWI, is open to ships of all peaceful nations.
So, national infrastructure with international duties.
Yeah.
And straits, like Gibraltar or Hormuz.
Straits used for international navigation have a special regime under UNCLS called the Right of Transit Passage. This allows ships and aircraft continuous and quick passage through the strait without being impeded or needing prior authorization from the coastal states. It's vital for global trade and naval mobility through critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Bosporus, Malacca, Gibraltar.
It really is a complex tapestry, isn't it? All these rules carefully negotiated over decades to manage shared spaces and ensure global movement.
A huge body of law, yes.
Or at least that's how it was supposed to work. Until, if you follow the logic of our sources, this 1798 deed supposedly rendered it all obsolete. It's just striking the sheer complexity built up over years versus the claimed simplicity of its undoing by one document.
The contrast is definitely stark. It highlights the immense effort involved in building and maintaining international order, and how radical the claim is that it could all be undone so easily.
Now, if this 1798 deed is supposedly triggered when a state collapses, becoming this sort of Plan B for World Order 2.0, it really forces us to ask, why do states collapse in the first place? Our sources dig into this, particularly the economic angle, linking it to debt cycles and the fragility of modern finance.
Yes, they draw heavily on analyses, like Ray Dalio's work, which argues that modern economies aren't really run on money, but on credit. Central banks create this credit, often out of thin air, and the whole system relies heavily on trust. Trust that the paper money has value, trust that governments can eventually pay back their debts. It's not really backed by hard assets anymore.
So, most of what we think of as wealth is actually just IOUs, debt owed by someone else.
In large part, yes. Money and credit are not tangible assets. They are merely accounting units. And governments, especially when facing crises or wanting to provide services, tend to spend more than they bring in. This leads to budget deficits and this ever-growing debt pyramid. They keep borrowing more to pay off old debts.
Kicking the can down the road.
Until they can't anymore, until trust breaks down.
And this raises that crucial question. If trust is the bedrock, what happens when it cracks, when people stop believing in the money or the government's ability to pay?
Well, that's when you can spiral into hyperinflation. And we're not talking about prices going up a bit each year. This is extreme, out-of-control price increases. The classic definition is over 50% per month. Money becomes essentially worthless incredibly quickly.
50% a month? How does that even happen?
Usually it's triggered by governments or central banks desperately printing huge amounts of money. They do it to cover massive budget deficits, pay off debts they can't otherwise afford, maybe stimulate a collapsing economy, but crucially, without any real economic growth to back it up.
So just flooding the system with cash.
Exactly. And once the public catches on, once they see their savings evaporating, they lose all confidence in the currency. Everyone tries to spend their money instantly before it loses more value, which just pours fuel on the fire, driving prices up even faster. It becomes a self-feeding panic.
And the consequences sound devastating, not just economic, but societal.
Utterly devastating. You see complete economic chaos. Businesses collapse, leading to mass unemployment, extreme poverty. Food shortages are common. Social unrest explodes. The financial system breaks down. Banks fail. The currency becomes totally worthless internationally. People flee the country if they can. That phrase, "first your money is gone," it's not just about losing savings, it's about the entire fabric of society disintegrating.
We've seen historical examples, right?
Oh yes. The Weimar Republic in Germany in 1923 is the textbook case, people needing wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. More recently, Zimbabwe in 2008 and the ongoing tragedy in Venezuela. It's a terrifying demonstration of what happens when monetary trust collapses.
Okay, so hyperinflation is one path to collapse, but states can also just run out of money to pay their debts, right? Like a company going bankrupt.
Yes, that's national bankruptcy or sovereign default. It's when a government simply cannot, or sometimes chooses not to, repay its debts or meet the interest payments.
And what usually triggers that? Is it just spending too much?
That's often a big part of it, excessive government spending over long periods. But it can also be triggered by sharp economic downturns that kill tax revenue. External shocks like a global financial crisis, or a major disaster, or just a sudden loss of confidence from creditors who refuse to lend any more money. Having a lot of debt in foreign currency or short-term debt that needs constant refinancing makes countries particularly vulnerable.
And the consequences of defaulting? Probably not good.
Not good at all. Usually a deep, painful recession follows. The country's banking system often becomes unstable or collapses. The currency tanks. Crucially, the country loses access to international credit markets, making it incredibly hard to borrow for years, sometimes decades. Governments are forced into harsh austerity, slashing spending on public services, pensions, jobs, which leads to more social hardship and political unrest.
Has it led to worse, like foreign intervention?
Historically, yes. In the 19th century, foreign creditors sometimes push for control over a defaulting country's finances, or even in extreme cases like Egypt in 1882, military intervention to protect their investments. More recently, think of Greece after 2008, or Argentina's repeated defaults. The key thing is, unlike corporate bankruptcy, there's no formal international court for sovereign default. It's always a messy, highly political process.
Political, not purely legal, driven by power dynamics.
Very much so. Outcomes depend on negotiation, leverage, geopolitics, not just some established legal procedure.
Okay, so it's clear that losing money, whether through hyperinflation or default, leads to chaos and instability. But how does that connect to war? One source had that chilling line, "First your money is gone, then you are ready for war." Is there really a direct link?
The sources argue there is, often drawing historical parallels. Widespread economic hardship, unemployment, poverty, people losing their life savings breeds deep dissatisfaction. It shatters public confidence in the existing government and institutions, making people desperate for radical change, any change.
And fertile ground for extremism.
Exactly. Economic inequality, especially, is known to fuel conflict. When people feel they have nothing left to lose, they become much more receptive to extreme ideologies, scapegoating, and promises of drastic solutions, even violent ones.
And the Weimar Republic is the prime example again.
It's the classic, tragic case study. The hyperinflation, followed by the Great Depression, destroyed the German middle class's savings and faith in democracy. This created the opening for extremist groups like the Nazi Party. The NSDAP masterfully exploited the misery, offering simplistic answers, blaming minorities, and promising national renewal through strength, which ultimately meant militarism and war.
So economic collapse can pave the way for a society to accept or even demand war as a supposed solution.
It can create that environment, yes. But the sources are also careful to critique the idea that war is actually a solution to economic problems.
Right, like the idea that WWII ended the Great Depression.
Exactly. While there's a correlation, deeper analysis suggests U.S. economic recovery was underway before full wartime mobilization, driven more by rearmament spending. War itself is incredibly destructive economically. It diverts resources from productive uses, destroys capital and infrastructure, racks up enormous debt, fuels inflation, and, of course, destroys human lives. It's almost always a net economic burden, leading to long-term problems, not a sustainable solution. The idea that war fixes economies is a dangerous myth.
A very dangerous myth. Okay, so bringing this full circle, how does this cycle of potential economic collapse link back to the 1498 deed? Why is this context important for understanding the deed's alleged role?
This is where the sources position the deed as the ultimate contingency plan. They claim the deed automatically comes into force the moment a state undergoes de facto collapse, whether that's through bankruptcy, hyperinflation, tearing institutions apart, or some other fundamental breakdown.
So it's not something someone actively triggers, it just happens when a state fails.
That's the assertion. It's described as the ultimate Plan B for World Order 2.0, a mechanism waiting in the wings for the old order to fail. And crucially, when it activates, the buyer of a deed doesn't just get the old barracks. They step into the legal void left by the collapsed state, becoming the successor party, not whatever new government might try to emerge.
And that's what triggers the domino effect, absorbing all the international treaties and networks tied to that collapsed state.
Exactly. The buyer becomes the sole contracting party for that state's international obligations and rights, which, given the interconnectedness of the treaty system, especially via NATO and UN links, according to the sources, supposedly pulls everything into the buyer's hands. It's presented as a preordained legal consequence of state failure in the modern, interconnected world.
A legal mechanism designed perhaps for a future of cascading state failures.
Yep.
Wow.
It frames the deed not just as a historical or legal curiosity, but as a mechanism intrinsically linked to the potential fragility of the modern nation-state system itself.
Okay, beyond financial collapse, there's another massive transformation brewing that our sources connect to this potential new world order under the 1498 deed, the rise of artificial intelligence. How does AI fit into this picture of a potential legal vacuum?
Well, the sources lean on thinkers like Yuval Noah Harari, who paints a potentially bleak picture. His argument, as presented, is that humans are rapidly losing their economic value and even their military usefulness thanks to automation and AI.
Machines taking over jobs, basically.
When at unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
This isn't just about factory robots anymore. Algorithms are increasingly capable of doing white-collar work, bank tellers, travel agents, paralegals, even aspects of jobs done by doctors, lawyers, managers, composers. The list keeps growing.
Which leads to what Harari calls the useless class, people whose labor is simply no longer needed.
That's his provocative term, yes. A large segment of the population potentially displaced by algorithms, facing not just unemployment, but an existential crisis, losing their sense of purpose, identity, and social contribution, which work often provides.
And you mentioned even creative fields aren't safe. AI composing music.
Exactly. What's truly fascinating and maybe unnerving is that AI is encroaching on areas we thought were uniquely human, like creativity, systems generating music, art, text. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness.
So if AI takes the jobs, where does the wealth go?
That's a huge concern. The prediction is that wealth and power could become incredibly concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite who own the key algorithms and the vast data sets they run on. This could create unprecedented inequality and algorithmic upper class.
And what happens to everyone else? The useless class.
Harari warns about the psychological fallout, the loss of identity, purpose, status, and the potential societal need to keep this large, potentially discontented group occupied and content, perhaps through immersive entertainment, drugs, virtual reality. Essentially, distractions to prevent social upheaval.
Distractions to manage a population that's no longer economically necessary. That's a dark vision.
It is, and it connects to another profound challenge AI poses, the potential undermining of individual autonomy.
How so?
Harari's concept, again, as cited in our sources, is that external algorithms, constantly monitoring our biology, our behavior, our choices, could eventually know me much better than I can ever know myself.
AI knowing our desires, our fears, our health risks better than we do.
Potentially, yes. By analyzing biochemical data, behavioral patterns, genetic information, algorithms could predict our actions and preferences with startling accuracy. This decouples intelligence, the ability to process data and solve problems, from consciousness, subjective experience. Authority could shift away from our own feelings and intuition towards the recommendations of these networked algorithms.
And it wouldn't necessarily be a forced takeover, but something we volunteer for.
That's the insidious part. It could be a voluntary surrender of autonomy. We might hand over decisions about our health, our careers, even our relationships to algorithms because we believe they'll make optimal choices for us or simply for convenience.
We already see hints of this, don't we? People using genetic testing to make health decisions, relying on algorithms for news feeds or dating matches, using wearables to track every heartbeat.
Exactly. Angelina Jolie's decision for a preventative mastectomy based on genetic risk, not symptoms. Google predicting flu outbreaks from search data. 23andMe analyzing DNA. Smartwatches monitoring our vital signs. People might, as one source puts it, willingly dismantle the barriers protecting our private spaces in exchange for better health, convenience, or perceived optimization.
So what's the ultimate danger here? An AI dictatorship?
It could lead towards something like an Orwellian surveillance state run by algorithms instead of a big brother figure. Or perhaps more subtly, the individual could just disintegrate gently from within, losing their sense of self, agency, and free will as they become increasingly guided, nudged, and defined by external systems.
And there's that disturbing point about medicine shifting from healing the sick to upgrading the healthy.
Yes, that potential shift from an egalitarian goal, health for all, to an elitist one, enhancement for the few. If the technology exists to significantly upgrade cognitive or physical abilities, it might only be available to a wealthy elite. This could lead to actual biological stratification, creating a gap far wider than mere economic inequality. And an enhanced elite might see little reason to care about the health or welfare of an unenhanced, perhaps economically useless majority.
Superhumans versus normal humans.
It's a dystopian scenario, but one that arises from these technological trends.
Okay, now let's try to tie this back one last time to the state succession deed 1290-98. If that deed really did end international law, creating a legal vacuum, what does that mean in a world increasingly shaped by powerful AI?
It creates a potentially terrifying synergy. If the buyer of 1498 truly holds absolute singular legal power in a world devoid of the old international legal structures, as the sources claim, then they would arguably have the unprecedented legal basis to define a new world order entirely from scratch. And this new order wouldn't necessarily be constrained by traditional notions of human rights, democracy, or state sovereignty, because those concepts were embedded in the very legal system the deed supposedly dismantled.
So the buyer could impose a system built around what? Efficiency, control, perhaps implemented through AI.
That's the speculative connection the sources hint at. A uniform global legal order could be established, potentially aligning with concepts like an electric technocracy or a highly centralized digital society, mentioned in related documents. The legal disempowerment of old states, combined with the rise of AI capable of monitoring and managing populations, could make humanity incredibly vulnerable to new forms of centralized governance.
A governance system where the rules haven't just changed, they've disappeared, leaving only the will of the buyer, potentially amplified by AI.
Exactly. In a world where human autonomy is already being challenged by technology, the alleged legal vacuum created by the 1498 deed could pave the way for a transition to a radically different, perhaps far more controlled, global system. It's a chilling thought, the convergence of a claimed legal singularity with the rise of potentially superhuman intelligence.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground today. It's been, well, mind-bending journey. We started with the basics, the definition of a state, how states are supposed to live and die under conventional international law.
Right, Montevideo, state succession, the established framework.
And then we plunged into the truly audacious claims surrounding the state succession deed 1 Shooter 98. This idea that a single obscure document somehow absorbed all international treaties, effectively disempowered all existing nations, and just ended the global legal order as we knew it.
A radical proposition, to say the least.
We explored the alleged consequences, this concept of a legal void, a tabula rasa, where old states are just actors without legitimacy, and founding new states becomes paradoxically impossible, yet, strangely, people might try to use the deed itself to claim sovereignty.
The strategic adaptation to a post-law world.
We even touched on how this supposed legal vacuum, when combined with the potential for economic collapse and the relentless rise of artificial intelligence, could set the stage for a completely new kind of global control, a post-normative equality where one entity, the buyer, holds all the legal cards and could dictate the terms of an AI-driven future.
It ties together legal theory, economics, and future technology in a very provocative way.
It really does. And it forces us to ask some fundamental questions. In a world where the legal foundations might be shattered, where money relies on fragile trust, and where machines might soon understand us better than we understand ourselves, what does sovereignty even mean anymore? And who, ultimately, gets to decide how things run?
These sources present a narrative where the world order has changed, silently perhaps, but documented. Their message seems to be, anyone involved in statecraft or international relations today needs to grapple with the possibility that the old rulebook is gone.
Right. All that's left, according to them, is the decision of the buyer and whether that buyer will permit any particular arrangement. It leaves us with a lot to think about. We definitely invite you, our listeners, to continue this deep dive. What stands out most to you from this radical reimagining of international law and global power?